Welcome to Chapter 8 of the Node Academy. We are talking about disaster preparation today. So this is not something that we want to happen, but this is something we want to be prepared to happen. So mainly a disaster means our node is somehow shot, unrecoverable, it's broken, impossible to start. We, of course, are going to try everything we can to start that node, but in some situations we might not be able to. So most of the time where this happens is the classical examples are, for example, we are running on Luna node and we forget to pay our bill. And after a while, Luna node will just delete the machine. Maybe they will give us some time to recover it, but if we wait for too long, then Luna node is just going to cut their losses and turn us off and delete all the data. And that means that all our channels are gone, that like our entire node is gone, we can't go back in. That's kind of like the worst case scenario. We might also have our physical node, if we have it at home, might also have some issues. It can just break, like in the worst case it will just catch fire. Not that it will catch fire on its own, but yeah, who knows. We have to be prepared for the worst. Even water damage is something that can happen. Something that's a little bit less dramatic, but maybe more likely to happen, is that a file system gets corrupted, especially if you're running on an SD card, which you probably are if you're running on a Pi and didn't listen to my recommendations, then the SD card is going to fry eventually. So systems like Umbrel, they protect against that by just putting all the data on the external SSD. So something like Umbrel wants to run with an external SSD. Typically they want you to have like a terabyte large SSD. And then the SD card is almost guaranteed to die within a year. But yeah, you can just replace the SD card and then you're up and running again and all your channels are still running. But let's assume that you are running a custom setup and all the data is on the SD card. Then after not too much time, the SD card will just break. And then the entire Raspberry Pi will no longer start up. If we're running an old laptop that has an HDD, that is also eventually going to happen. HDDs break very differently, so before the HDD completely breaks, there's going to be some warning signs, especially Bitcoin Core is very sensitive to hard disk failures. So if you see Bitcoin Core crashing a lot, especially if you read like I/O errors, then that's a good sign that maybe a HDD just needs to be replaced. And of course, if we're migrating a node, if we're moving from one system to another, there's also some things that can happen, so we have to be very careful. Of course, in that situation, we still ideally have our old data, but if we are not, if we're not paying full diligence, then this is also where like something can break. So for the most obvious situations, we have to pay our bills to Luna node and deposit enough sats. We have to use the proper power supplies, especially if you're on a Pi. Like, don't plug the USB cable directly into the wall. Have something in between that can properly absorb like high voltage. So you notice that typically even a modern laptop that it runs on USB-C, it's not a USB-C cable that plugs directly into the wall. It has like a thick brick somewhere in the middle that is able to absorb shocks. We advise you to use quality SSDs. If you can set it up, you might even partition them between, for example, Bitcoin data, operating system data, or LND data. In a very professional setup, this is not really something we'd use at home, but we might use something like RAID, where we have multiple SSDs where all the data is mirrored. Apart from that, we just have to be prepared. And this preparation, so in this guide, there are only 3 points. And the first one is a very obvious one, but it is a good reminder that we should keep the seed somewhere safe. So the seed was generated at the time, so in the chapter where we configure LND, we run LND. So when we run LND for the first time, we create a wallet, and that wallet gives us a seed phrase, and the seed phrase is only accessible once. So if you didn't write it down then the second best option is you have to write down your xpub, your xpriv, which is a bit more annoying to keep safe because it's not as resistant to errors, like writing down some 24 English words. These all private keys in your Bitcoin node, or in your Lightning node rather, all private keys in your Lightning node are derived from that seed. So no matter if it's keys used in authentication or communication, or keys used for like your actual Bitcoin Lightning pub key is derived from that, but also all the Bitcoin private keys are derived from that. So if we want to recover our Bitcoin, if we want to recover anything, the first thing we always need is our seed phrase. Without a seed phrase, we can't do anything. And if you have set a passphrase for the seed, then you also have to back that up. So you can back that up together or separately, but somewhere it needs to be somewhere accessible. Don't rely on remembering it. Now, every kind of recovery that we might eventually have to do, I've had to do 2 recoveries so far in my life, and one of them was very smooth. The other one was not so smooth because it was very old node, very old channels from times when things were handled a little bit differently. But every recovery starts with a new node. So if we want to recover our Lightning node, then we first need to start a new node. There are some online tools that you start a new node with just a click. You can also recover in Umbrel, or you can also just, depending on what broke, use your existing node and just run LND separately. And then we need to enter our seed phrase. That allows us to restore a Lightning node that has the same pub key, meaning we're able to sign messages and communicate and kind of authenticate ourselves as, hey, this is the node that owned these channels. But also it allows us to recover all the Bitcoin that are still held in that node. So if we were to perform a recovery, the first thing we would do is start a new node, enter our existing seed phrase with eventually the passphrase, and then we would scan through the entire blockchain since the birthday of our node to look for any kind of Bitcoin still lying around in the hot wallet, and then we would send those out. The second thing is we would emergency close our channels, and for this, so if you think of this in a kind of manual and primitive way, then we would look on, let's say, on Ambus. Here, this is my node on Ambus. We would look on Ambus and just go through the list of channels, and we theoretically would just contact each of these channel partners and say, hey, Bull Bitcoin, please close my channel. Hey, Coinos, please close my channel. Hey, Bitrefill, please close my channel. But instead, we're going to, we have a way to automate this. And this file is called the static channel backup, and it's a bit of a misleading name because it's not actually a backup. It's more of a emergency distress beacon. So I'm gonna, in this, here I'm gonna log into my node, SSH, my username is Ubuntu. I did now attach a domain name to my node. That makes it easy for me to connect to it. So you can see here I connect lnd.nodeacademy.org now points to our test node. I have some updates I can apply, even though this is not exactly the scope of this. I always like to perform some of the basic maintenance at the start. Sudo apt update and sudo apt upgrade. This is actually a very big update, 240 megabyte, but it shouldn't take too long. So I'll just talk about the static channel backups. It's a file that every LND node has that contains information about all the channels that the node has, including all their peers, and how to reach those peers. And this channel backup is encrypted with your public key, or rather, yeah, with your public key, meaning only once you have the seed phrase are you able to make use of this channel backup. This is also quite convenient because it means that we don't really need to worry too much about who has access to this channel backup. Like, this is something that we can put into our Google Drive, for example, or into our Dropbox. Unlike other files, unlike, for example, our wallet, or unlike our seed phrases, we can find this file in LND data chain Bitcoin mainnet, and in here it's called the channel backup. If we try to open it, it looks like scrambled because it's decoded in a different way. But what we are able to do is we are able to read this file and output it. Channel backup, is that what it's called? I did write it down here. It's called export chan backup. So to get this, we just have to select all, and this is what this file looks like. This is the information contained in this file. Apologies. And theoretically, all we would need now is we could just copy paste this, and we could put it into a text file. If we needed to. So this is kind of the first thing that I can recommend you doing when you, once in a while, or let's say every time you open a new channel, you could just run this command, and then maybe ideally you just copy everything and you open up a text editor and just paste it in here and then save it on your machine. That's already like quite a useful thing. Unless you open a lot of channels, you might need some automation. But for the most time, you're going to be the one opening channels, and every time you open a channel, just remember to export this channel backup. And I've written down here a second option to write down this channel backup. So if let's say I go back into my main computer, then I can use this SCP command, which stands for secure copy. So secure copy lets you copy files over SSH. So instead of logging into the machine and then copying the file, pasting it into a document, you can just, here I have to replace this with my actual URL, and then you notice lnd.nodeacademy.org, and then here's this colon, and here's a path, and this has to be an absolute path. It doesn't accept the squiggles to the file that I want to copy. So home ubuntu.lnd data chain bitcoin mainnet channel.backup, and here now this is relating to my local storage, and here I can put in whatever I want. Here, if I now press OK, it's going to log into the machine, copy the file. Took 0 seconds, and I can do that as often as I want. It will always just replace it. So this is the second option you have. Copy this command to like, keep it handy somewhere. Replace the middle part here with your IP address. If you're using a different username other than Ubuntu, then this has to be corrected too. If you're not on Linux, then probably your file system looks a little bit different here too. But you can change this command, and then you can just execute it every time. You could even, so let me copy this. You could even make a bash aliases, right? So here's a lot of aliases that I use. Could make an alias channel backup. Paste this in here. And now, if I open a new browser, all I have to do is type in channel backup, and it will kind of remember the command and do the backup. So this is also something that you could do. And this is also theoretically where then you have some options to automate this, which I haven't done for myself, and which I only recommend to do if you're really running like a node that has a lot of channels and has a lot of new channels. Like theoretically, Eric has some good advice on this, like how to make a small script that detects every time this file changes, and if it does change, for example, copy it to your machine or copy it to an extra drive. So if you're running Lightning on a spare laptop, for example, you could just plug in a USB stick and then have a little script that every time this file gets changed, a backup gets written onto the USB stick. And then you can kind of hope that even if the computer is destroyed for some reason, the USB stick survives. And the last thing that we need to know is that we also kind of want to keep the other data. So even if you have your seed phrase and your channel backup, don't just delete data from your node. There are some instances where you still need to manually go into the channel database if it exists, and maybe force close channels yourself, even at the risk of losing the funds. So with the maybe a bit more detail about what this channel backup does is, I can also go back in and demonstrate this this verify lncli. What is it? Verify chan backup. Yes, verify chan backup. I can give it the multi-file path, which is going to be lnd data chain Bitcoin mainnet, and then channel backup. And then here these squiggly brackets without an error message just kind of indicates that it's success. So the channel backup is correct, meaning it does belong to this node. Just gives us a bit more assurance that we really have the right file. So if we were to use this channel backup, let's say we want to perform a recovery of our node, what it could have happened. We forgot to pay our bill with Luna Node, and Luna Node shut down our node. But luckily we have our seed phrase and we have the channel.backup, and now we start a new node and we want to recover our Bitcoin. So first we scan through the blockchain. This is something LND will do automatically for any kind of sats it can find in the on-chain wallet. Then we will send those out. And now we will close all the channels. So we will take this channel backup, and I'm not going to execute this command now, even though my channel is actually dead. I'm a bit sad about that, but my channel died for some reason. We were to use this restore channel backup, and then we would also again select the path to the file. And once we do that, the Lightning node will look into the channel file, channel backup, and then learn about our list of channels. It does not know the balances of these channels, but it will then send a distress signal to all the peers. So it knows what these channels are, and it knows who these peers are. And it will ask these peers, please force close the channel on me. And then hopefully the peer will fulfill this request. And the peer will say, okay, sorry about that, sucks to see you go. The peer doesn't really have any incentive at this point to not force close the channel. So they will force close the channel with you, and then your node, knowing what kind of channels to accept, will monitor this force close and will then sweep the funds back into your on-chain wallet, from where you can send it to an external drive, external wallet. But there are instances where this fails, and these are the cases where you aren't able to reach your peer. So sometimes your peers are offline, and if your peers are offline, they aren't able to force close the channel. In those situations, sometimes it just helps to wait for a few days or a week. Eventually some of your channel peers will come back online. But what if they don't come online? And in the worst case, what if they also lost their data? What if you lost your data and they lost your data? And in that case, if that was really the case, that both you and your channel peer lost your data, then you wouldn't really be able to get your Bitcoin back. Then they're more or less stuck. So theoretically, you could still recover it manually, but since neither side really knows what the funds are in the channel, you would have to go to your peer in person or manually, and you would have to kind of negotiate with them of how do you split the sats in that channel, and then you would have to use some very complicated recovery tools to get the sats out. And one way to avoid this is to keep the channel database. So don't necessarily recommend to update it because it's not to export it because it's not exactly useful in the short run. It should be here in L&D data. Chain Bitcoin mainnet, and it's called the where's the channel DB? Here's the channel DB. So this file in L&D data graph mainnet is if you really do suffer from a catastrophic failure, but do have access to this file, then it is worth it to record at least this file, ideally the entire .lnd directory, just in case you have a peer that isn't able to respond. Running a node with an outdated channel DB is almost guaranteed to cause you to lose your channels and some of the funds in those channels. So you would only really use it as a last resort in case that you consider your funds almost already lost. Then you can publish a commitment transaction. And if that commitment transaction turns out to be outdated, which is why I don't recommend to make a regular updates of this file, I just recommend to take it if you have a disaster. Then you have the risk of that channel state being out of date, meaning your peer gets not just their side of the channel, but also gets your side of the channel. And with that, I am going to stop sharing the screen, and I'm going to ask some questions or answer some questions. So if you have some questions around backups, then please ask now. Or ask later in the chat. That's also fine. I think we have one node at least still outstanding without a channel. And then we have some nodes that have a channel but are currently offline. So those are always worth restarting. Yeah, so just occasionally check into your node. If you do connect Zeus to your node, depending on what connection mechanism you use, you should be able also to do a lot of like just checking on Zeus. This will also tell you if you're out of sync or out of date. Yeah. You won't lose your. Generally, you won't lose your sats as long as you have your seed phrase, and even your seed phrase is kind of the minimal you need. The channel backup is useful if you have a lot of channels and you don't know your peers. I think as long as you know your peer or have a limited number of peer, even without the channel backup, you'd be able to get your sats back simply by in your case, for example, you just have to message me and say, hey, please close our channel. But the channel backup is definitely a useful thing to have because it kind of automates the whole process. You don't need to message me. You can just use this file, and then my node will automatically force close. It's quite useful if you have 10 channels and you need to. I, for example, wouldn't be able to contact all of my channel partners. It's useful to know who your channel partners are, but sometimes it's also useful to not know. All right, if there are no more questions, then I'm gonna end it here.